Hi, my name is Graham Berlin, and I'm a first-year clinical psychology student here at Ryerson University. And my research is based out of the HIV Prevention Lab, and my work with the Jack Layton Chair is supported by the Arts Public Scholar Program. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Randy Jackson for Layton Short. And this short is part of the Social Justice During COVID-19 series put on by the Jack Layton Chair. So Dr. Randy Jackson is an assistant professor with the School of Social Work in the Department of Health, Aging, and Society at McMaster University. And Randy is an expert in long-term wellness among Aboriginal men living with HIV. So Randy, thank you for being here today.
You're welcome. I'm happy to join and talk about what I do.
Excellent. Okay, so to get things started, I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about how you came to find yourself doing the research that you do.
Oh, that's actually a pretty long story.
Is there a 5-minute version?
The 5-minute version is let me think here. I wasn't quite prepared to answer that kind of a question, but let's just say that as an Indigenous, like as a gay person, right? I early on in the epidemic, I had many good friends who had tested positive for HIV, and I wanted to contribute in some way to support what they were going through, and my interest evolved to include a focus on Aboriginal or Indigenous people here in Canada. And so I've been largely, what I guess the passion comes from a personal connection to both the gay community and also to my community that I most closely and culturally identify with, which is Indigenous. Yeah. So that's the short story.
That's perfect. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I was wondering if you could briefly give an overall description of the work that you do and tell me what you're currently working on.
Oh, okay. I'm on multiple projects, but I think what generally propels me to become involved in research is this interest. It's this really deep interest in how Indigenous knowledges can be mobilized to better understand and respond to the challenges as well as the opportunities that are related to HIV experienced by Indigenous communities here in Canada. And so I believe that when you think through an Indigenous lens, that you actually potentially arrive at new understandings of what it means to be living with HIV. And it's those different understandings that I think are essential to the development of programs or policies that are specific to Indigenous people living with HIV or at risk or affected by, I guess.
Yeah. And could you say more maybe about how that perspective is different coming from that Indigenous perspective?
Well, I mean, Western knowledge is pretty linear in some respects, right? Yeah. And I think that Indigenous knowledges are sort of a collectivist kind of perspective on the world. It explores ideas around connection and how connection is extremely important in terms of Indigenous health. So those are the kinds of things I think that it uncovers a bit differently. Yeah, so like I said, I'm involved in a range of projects. I think at last count there was about 10 or 12 of them. And so I'm not going to like talk about all of them, but I'm going to sort of focus on perhaps some of the projects that I'm more actively involved in. And the first one I want to talk about is the Feast Center for Indigenous ST-BBI Research, which I'm sure you've read about, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is something that was just recently funded, and there'll be a website, so you might want to include the website later on at the end. I'll send you the details. We're just getting up and launching around that, but really the Feast Center is about a way, it's looking at maybe accomplishing four things, right? It's about engaging and facilitating and supporting sort of the use of Indigenous knowledge in STBBI research, right? It's about stimulating sort of multi-stakeholder collaboration, right? So the grant is about, it cuts across the four pillars of health, from basic science to clinical to epidemiology to social sciences, right? So it's about strengthening that collaboration, and it's about contributing to the development of sort of highly skilled, multidisciplinary community of investigators, and we include community in that definition, right? So we we designed a range of training opportunities that span from the undergraduate experience right through to like career scholars. So I think we have about 9 different training opportunities that are available, and those are slowly starting to be launched. We're about to launch our first one fairly shortly, which is, again, and I'll talk about that a bit later, but it's the first grant. The first grant, the training opportunity is about, is going to be focused on COVID-19, and it's how that works within, or how it's experienced within the context of STBIs. Right, so that's what we're going to be doing there. And then the fourth thing that we're trying to do is sort of foster sort of uniquely Indigenous knowledge translation products that perhaps might increase the uptake and of that knowledge and the implementation of that knowledge in other health programs or in policy. So that's the first thing that I'm involved in. And again, that's just a project that's been recently funded. We got word, it's a 5-year project. So and it's national in scope. We have about 50 investigators from across the country who are involved. A smaller team of what we call a governing council that provides me direction. I work very closely with my community partner, which is Renee Mashing at the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, and she's based in Halifax. So she's my co-lead, and we work to get this grant up and running. So we've been operational for about the last 8 months or so, and just slowly developing the infrastructure that will support a grant of this size. So that's taking a bit of time to do, which was expected, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge undertaking. But
yeah.
Also, if I'm hearing you right, it almost sounds like the Feast Center is almost kind of covering all the bases of research with the Indigenous communities across Canada, in that you're not only setting up like what are the areas of focus and how that should go about, but also training people in how to do that, so that even if the Feast Center later on does not exist, hopefully you've created kind of almost this cycle of training and knowledge translation that can feed back into itself.
I mean, we know from we as Indigenous scholars, I think that and I'm talking globally, I think that we've developed a very comprehensive, good understanding of the contours of what Indigenous knowledge is and what it means, right? And in the context of the research that I do, what seemed to be sort of missing, or actually it was more of an opportunity to go in a different direction here, was to like start asking the question about, okay, now that we know what we know about Indigenous knowledges, I mean, how can that be mobilized to develop more innovative or different kinds of methods of gathering data? And secondly, how, once you've gathered that data, how can you mobilize or understand that data you collected through an Indigenous lens? And so those are sort of the 2 core things that the Feast Center is trying to do. And we're going to be funding training opportunities that are moving in that kind of direction. So we're asking people to think about that. And again, from across Canada, think about what that means and what that might look like. Yeah, so that's sort of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. It's very exciting.
Yeah, yeah, and as you said, I mean, 5 years is a short space of time, but at the end of the day, I think that a 5 year period here might, I mean, not that we're going to change the world, but we hope that will be that will start that journey.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think that journey's already started too, because you're starting to see more and more literature being published that are talking about Indigenous method. Yeah, for example.
Okay, and is there anything else you want to say about the Feast Center? We can always come back to it.
Yeah, I'm sure we can come back to it. Yeah.
Okay, and what
Yeah.
other projects are you currently working on?
Well, I'm also connected to TransPulse Canada.
Okay, right.
And yeah, and TransPulse Canada is looking at sort of trans health. All right, and we sort of build it as the Canadian trans health census study, right? And so this is a very large project. Again, I think that there are about 109 people involved in some way, shape, or form. We have 9 priority populations that are helping to direct that work. And so last summer, at the beginning of last summer, we launched the Trans Pulse Survey, which enrolled upwards of about 2,000 people 2,000 trans people from across Canada. And there's a report available. The first community report is available and is on the Trans Pulse Canada website, and I can send you the link for that later.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So that's the first report that's being released. I work very closely, and I lead as part of that project the Indigenous Priority Population Group, and this is the TransPulse Canada is treating that priority population a bit differently. So they've allocated additional monies to that priority population group, the Indigenous priority population. And my job, or my role there, is to really bring together Indigenous trans people to design a smaller qualitative research project nested within that larger survey. That's going to explore what exactly makes Indigenous trans people healthy. Like what are their needs, or what are their experiences around this? And so that's what we're working on right now. We're just finishing up the tail end of a literature review that's going to be used to help us ground a future grant that is exploring what makes Indigenous trans people healthy. Right, so that's what we're working on there. Any questions about that project? Or
So I was just wondering, with those interviews, are you still conducting those interviews, or is that something that has wrapped up now?
well, the survey part of it was finished, I think, in the early fall, right? So between fall and now, the statisticians are working at number crunching, and just yesterday I got about 4 or 5 tables asking me to have a look at those and perhaps write a bit about what those tables, what we found. So I'm working on that later today. But
That's
yeah.
exciting in a different way.
Yeah, it's exciting, and again, I'm not a numbers person, right? So I'm going to do the best I can, and then the epidemiologists who are involved in the project will have a look at what I've done and perhaps tweak it, or maybe I didn't understand something related to the numbers, right? So yeah.
That's why it helps to work within a team, right? To have that collaboration.
Yeah, and again, I'm taking a first stab at this, but it goes back to the Indigenous priority population who will read and comment and change it again. So it's all good. That's the nature of the work.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And okay, and is there
Well, when you introduced me, you said I had this expertise in Indigenous men, right?
Yes.
That's an emerging area for me.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's became deeply interested in, in Indigenous men's experiences of HIV. And largely that came from my connection with Tracy Prentice and Doris Peltier, I'm a co-investigator on their Visioning Health project. And I noticed that you're going to promote a webinar with them later on. So yeah, you know, the Indigenous men across the country have been watching and listening to these Indigenous women speak about visioning health and speaking about I guess the potential, but also the experience of being a part of that project as being a very healing experience for them. And so the Indigenous men started asking, so where's our project? You know, we want one too, right? And so and they approached me, I don't know, about 6 years ago, I think, somewhere around there, asking me to do this project with him. And it took me about 4 years to write a planning grant. And a planning grant is really about gathering people together to plan sort of future research, right? And so I applied for this planning grant, and Ken Moffat is part of that, as well as a number of other sort of Indigenous and allied scholars are part of the focus on Indigenous masculinity, right? And so again, and we have community members as well. So we have, and that grant is Indigenous masculinity and HIV wellness, right? And again, it's a planning grant. The goal of that grant is to plan future research that examines sort of the ways HIV positive Indigenous men come to learn and practice sort of a positive masculine identity as they respond to challenges around living with HIV or other chronic illnesses. So again, the planning grant was really about conducting sort of a review of the literature, because we needed to know what we already know, right? So we did that, or we're about to do that. We're just, again, I have multiple things in the oven here.
Yeah, no
so
kidding.
we're just finalizing the literature review, and we're about to start working on the grant, which we'll hopefully submit sometime in early October. So we're looking at Indigenous masculinity and chronic illness in that literature review. We recruited men from across the country. I think we had about 8 or 9 men come to a focus group here in Toronto, where we asked them about what they want to know about in the grant. And we're working with graduate students, a graduate student on the project, as well as students from other investigators who have been a part of the project. And so we've already sort of disseminated preliminary findings of that literature review at 2 different conferences this past fall. And then we hope to have a publication of the literature review coming up fairly shortly. But anyways, those 2 things, the literature review and the focus groups, are about planning this future research. So, and often, sometimes it does take that long to develop a grant. I've been working on it for over a year now.
Oh.
Yeah. So there you have it. So that's like the third project. And then I had, and if you don't have any questions about that project, I have like a 4th one I want to tell you about.
Okay. Maybe I'll hold my questions, and tell me about the 4th one.
Oh, well, if you have a question specific to the Indigenous one, that's fine.
I have more of a question about a lot of what I'm hearing you talk about with your research seems to kind of center around this kind of community-based research methods.
Yeah.
Just with the focus group and kind of starting within the community as the starting point for research.
Right.
And I was kind of wondering if you could speak to a little bit about that community research practices and how that's a bit different from more traditional research practices.
I'm not sure it's that different, right, than traditional sort of other, I'm sure you're talking about sort of mainstream CBR projects and how it's different. And I don't think that it's entirely that different in terms of the principles that inform what you do. I mean, what it looks like at the end of the day could be completely different depending on community involvement, really. But the approach that we use in terms of CBR, and much of this will be echoing for you, is looking at ways of developing partnerships, collaboration, and community involvement across all phases of the research, from planning of research to being part of research teams, to helping to gather the data, helping understand the data, helping to present and return data back to our findings back to community. So we have community involved across all of those phases of the research. Sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it doesn't. It really depends. And what I mean by work well or not work well is it really depends on the community members that are sitting at the table and the ways in which they want to be involved, right? So it's different in every project. And I think that perhaps what might be different is in terms of what one does in terms of stimulating that kind of collaboration, and in many ways. And I think this is why Visioning Health has inspired research across the country in terms of strength-based approaches, is because if you design a research project really well, that project can actually be very healing for people to participate in. And in many ways, what's different then about CBR in our context is the inclusion of ceremony as part of gathering data, learning about that data, understanding what that data means, and doing that in ceremony. I mean, the pursuit of knowledge, right, the development of new knowledge, I think is very much a sacred pursuit, and it's behooves us to include ceremony at every opportunity, right? And largely that is directed by community members who ask for specific kinds of ceremony, because again, when you're working nationally and you're working with many different Indigenous groups across Canada, different cultural groups across Canada, the ceremonies shift, right? There are different ceremonies in different regions of the country, and so it's about us being very flexible in that respect. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I think
that's a beautiful answer, and that's
okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so you said you had a fourth project, even though it's you have many more after that, but the one you wanted, another one you want to focus on.
I know it's crazy. Yeah, the other one I've been involved in, this is a project I think that's been in about 8 or 9 years in development. And it's called the GIPA Home Fire. And it's about better understanding the way Indigenous people living with HIV are assuming and responding to the challenges of HIV through their leadership, right? So we want to better understand Indigenous leadership in the HIV movement. And very early on, and I said that this has been a project that has been about 8 or 9 years in the making. It took us 3 tries to actually end up getting funded for this project. So we had 2 earlier versions of the project that were denied or declined or rejected, I guess. And so, but it was such an important issue to the Indigenous HIV positive community that we pursued it, and because they critiqued these Indigenous leaders in the movement who are living with HIV, critiqued GIPA as being culturally inappropriate in some cases. And so they want to, for lack of a better word, indigenize principles of GIPA. And what I'm talking about here is the greater involvement of people living with AIDS in the movement, sort of the nothing about us without us kind of approach, right? But they wanted to better understand GIPA. They want to develop a new model of Indigenous leadership that's very much grounded in Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing, and to evaluate sort of the impact of that new model, and to critically examine the uptake of GIPA in organizations across Canada. So again, that's a project that'll be finished up in about a year or so. Yeah, so we have a survey that's currently in data collection. So we have a survey that's across Canada. I can send you the link for that as well.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That is attempting to enroll Indigenous people to respond to that survey, which is looking at, you know, what are the health impacts of you being involved in leadership roles, right? And then we have a smaller component of the study. It's really a mixed method study, so it's combining quantitative and qualitative approaches. And so we have we're about a third of the way through doing one-on-one interviews with Indigenous leaders across Canada. And so yeah, we're about as I said, a third of the way through that, and about halfway through the survey. We hope to have all this wrapped up, you know, early in the fall. Yeah, so that's what we're doing there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
First, congratulations on, I mean, persisting with a 9-year project, and to be kind of, even though there's a ways to go with it into the fall, you're basically at the finish line with that, I guess.
Yeah. This was an issue that was brought to the forefront by a guy by the name of Tony Novus, who has since passed away. He's in the spirit world. And yeah, and it was something that he wanted to better understand, and he essentially mobilized people from across Canada to push the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network to look at the issues of leadership, right? And again, I was more than happy to become involved, and I became involved really early on. When I was in the room when the motion was tabled at their annual general meeting, and everybody was resoundingly supportive of this project, which is why we stuck with it, right? It's why we continue to have a look at sort of feedback we got from reviewers of the grant when they rejected us, took up critically their feedback, and I think at the end of the day, we designed a fairly strong grant that's exploring these issues because of that feedback we got from reviewers. And then when we submitted it to ethics, we got even further feedback, which again, I think really strengthened the work that we're currently working on. Yeah.
Right. That's very exciting. You have, like you said, you have a lot on the go.
Yeah, that's like, yeah, but anyways, I won't go into the other part. But you know, I like I said, I'm involved in a number of other studies, and I assume less of a leadership role in those areas, but remain supportive of the work that's being undertaken by other projects.
Fantastic.
That I'm connected with. Yeah.
And then just kind of while we're still talking about the projects, I was wondering, given kind of the current climate with COVID-19, I was wondering if that's kind of impacted any of the research you're doing right now.
Well, yeah, in a big way, in some ways. I mean, we typically know that when we apply for grants, right, we always have perhaps larger travel budgets and that's sort of the feedback we get from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, right? We have larger travel dollars, and so in our budgets, and that's because it's important for Indigenous people to come together and be face to face when they do this kind of work. It's critical. It's important. It's part of health for many people to come together, and so COVID really shifted that in a big way. Right, so we are no longer meeting face to face. It shifted the way in which you do ceremony, for example, in many respects. You know, sort of pipe ceremonies, just as a quick example, needs to be adapted for the time being to the realities of COVID-19, and you know, keeping people safe. Right, so those are the kinds of things that have shifted. but it's the shift away from being in person to working online. That's, I think, is something that like all other researchers across the country, or maybe around the world for that matter, are trying to respond to in appropriate ways. And for us, this meant, again, no travel, doing things online, virtually as much as we can. The biggest impact it had so far was on the feast center that I talked about earlier, right? So we had originally planned undergrad student scholarships this coming summer, working in person on a project that they identified, and that, of course, first it got canceled, and then we brought it back, realizing, oh my God, maybe students need the money, right? And so we brought it back and redesigned it to be entirely online, and so we're about to launch. We have about 4 students arriving towards early June, and we're going to be working with them virtually rather than in person. And they're going to be working on a variety of different projects, which I'm still waiting to hear about. And mostly because of the way in which the applications come in, I'm not quite certain what people are going to be involved in. But we've used things like Slack, which is a website that helps you manage projects in a virtual way. We use Google Drive to collaborate. Yeah, and I'm sure other people are doing this, and these are not new approaches. These are just things that we're using more of. And again, OneDrive, we've participated in conferences virtually rather than in person. So I had about 8 or 9 trips scheduled between April and July, traveling different places to present at different conferences. And of course, all of that got canceled. Yeah. And about a third of those conferences have decided to move their conferences virtually. And so we participated in the Canadian Association of HIV Research conferences late April, early May. And we're about to participate again. We're prepared to participate virtually in the Indigenous pre-conference, which was originally scheduled to happen early July, I believe, in San Francisco. Yeah, so we were going to do those kinds of things. Yeah, but again, it all shifted. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a shame that you can't, like you said, that kind of in-person element and that community element is so important for all research, but particularly for your research. And so it's quite an adaptation process. But
yeah, big time. Yeah, I've been on Zoom meetings for research-related meetings where we have people where we do our own smudging, and with everybody that we're witnessing, right? And it's been quite an interesting experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then kind of the final question I wanted to ask you was, I was wondering kind of like what the motivation for your work is and what keeps you going up against kind of some of these challenges.
Yeah, well, it's probably really, you probably read my bio on the university website, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I've been doing this kind of thing. I've been reading. I mean, when I was in undergrad, right, back in, I won't tell you how long, early 90s, I was an undergrad at the University of Ottawa. And I think I was the only Indigenous, or felt like, if I wasn't, I felt like I was the only Indigenous person that was currently on that campus. And certainly I was probably the only Indigenous person in my undergrad cohort. So there was that experience, but there was also the experience of going to lectures and being given assignments and being told what to read and what to understand. And I don't think I had one lecture that even focused on Indigenous concerns or Indigenous experiences. So I went to, I would negotiate with professors that I was working with to write papers about Indigenous experiences. And when I got approval to do those kinds of things and started going into the literature to find out, to support my arguments, I found that researchers overwhelmingly tended to pathologize Indigenous people by focusing specifically and only on their challenges. And there was very, very little attention to, if any, to this idea of Indigenous cultures being very beautiful, offering enormous amounts in terms of how to live well, how to be healthy, those kinds of things. And so this was really, I think, the early motivation for the work I do, is wanting to push back against that, but also to not just to be critical about it, but also to contribute a sort of a different way of understanding a similar kind of a problem, right? Yeah, so that's sort of the motivation around it. It was to stop pathologizing Indigenous people for the challenges that they encounter. Understand that in large part, the challenges that Indigenous people encounter are the direct result of colonial intrusion in their lives, and that has shaped the health experience for many Indigenous people. And then you know that, right? But then you go out into the world and you're with Indigenous people. I mean, I identify as Indigenous, right? I'm an Anishinaabe, and so you know that when researchers write in the way that they write about Indigenous people in that pathologizing kind of way, that there's elements of truth to it, right? But then you're always thinking, yeah, but what about this? What about that, right? And oftentimes those yeah, but are about the strengths of Indigenous culture in terms of supporting a people to be healthy. And it's that I want to put out in the world. I want that kind of a way. I want to influence the way people think about Indigenous people in more positive, healthy ways than only thinking about us as victims of colonization, because that is not what we are, right? That's not who we are. We have much to offer each other as Indigenous people, but we have much, I think, to offer the world about what it means to be healthy from an Indigenous perspective. And it's that we don't know very much about, I think, particularly, especially in the context of HIV, right? We don't know much about that yet. We're starting to.
Yeah, and I think, when you say that, where this kind of started from, I think it's amazing that even just through this interview, like I can see how that has carried through for all of your work.
Yeah, in large part, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that is about time for us. So Randy, I want to thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your knowledge and the work that's going on that you're doing right now. As we had kind of briefly mentioned, I just wanted to let people know if they're interested in kind of learning more about research within this area. There is a webinar coming up called Shifting the Narrative, and it's a health-focused approach to research with HIV-positive Aboriginal women. And that's happening June 18th from 12 to 1 p.m. and it's free to join. And we will also post that link with the video. So Randy, thank you again once more. And I wish you luck with all of your projects, especially given what's going on with everything in the world right now. But I wish you the best and thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.